Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room as we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. I've been looking forward to today's conversation with Professor Tony Saich at Harvard Kennedy School. He's a world-renowned expert on China. His experience with China dated back to the 70s when he was a British exchange student. Last year, Harvard University also published his book, From Rebel to Ruler, 100 Years of the Chinese Communist Party. It's such a classic piece of work that should be in the syllabus of China 101 for all college students, in my view. As the world awaits the CCP's upcoming 20th Party Congress later in October, and as China undergoes yet another major political, economic, and social transformation, we're asking Professor Saich to help us get a better sense of where China is headed under Xi Jinping's third term as the party Secretary General and the country's chairman. Professor Saich, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm actually delighted to be here. And thanks especially for the promotion of the book.
Of course. As one of the world's foremost experts on China, so help us understand the mysterious CCP on the heels of the 20th Party Congress. What is the significance of the so-called 20and what is going to be decided at 20and how is it going to impact the rest of the world?
Well, party congresses, because they only take place once every 5 years, are always actually important events. To be honest, not much gets decided at the Congress. It's already been cooked up before they meet, but it's an extremely important symbolic gathering of the party elite. This particular meeting of 20is even more important, given that it is almost certain to confirm Xi Jinping's reappointment for a third term at the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, which essentially will extend his rule out probably to 2035, depending on health, other conditions. And also it will do a number of other things. It will set in place the appointment of a number of his acolytes to leading positions. It will revise the party statutes, probably in a way that reinforces the dominance of Xi Jinping and his ideas within the Chinese Communist Party. And also it will stress the kind of outline of policy that China's will pursue over the next few years. So what might that be? Very briefly, I think it's going to be continuity rather than change, which means that the tough political atmosphere that we've seen in recent years will continue. On the economy, we're liable to see a continuation of a very state-oriented focus to economic activity with private sector, domestic, international, acceptable as long as it pursues and promotes the main priorities of the Chinese Communist Party. And externally, I think we'll see a continuance of a more aggressive promotion of what China defines as its core national interests. We'll have the carrots of the trade and investment, but of course the sticks pushing more strongly around questions of sovereignty.
It's interesting you use the word continuity to describe China's next 5 to 10 years, when I think a lot of people feel that China actually has changed quite a bit over the last 5 to 10 years under Xi Jinping's leadership. Of course, you take a long view. You've written a book about the CCP for the 100 years. So maybe you can help us understand sort of, first of all, why did you write this book? What do you hope the readers could learn from your writing?
Yeah, I mean, on this question of change and continuity, I mean, if you look over the longer trends, there's certainly continuous themes which predate Xi Jinping, the preeminence of the party, the preference for the state over society, so forth. I mean, even common prosperity, which people have pointed to as being a key feature now under Xi Jinping. That was already there in many of Deng Xiaoping's comments much earlier, that once China reached a certain point of affluence, then would come the time to think about redistribution and bringing up those who had not benefited so well. Even on questions of sovereignty, they've always been lurking there in the background. And I think the difference now, of course, is that Xi Jinping has the tools, the influence, and the power to exert more aggressively those interests of China. As you say, yes, we have witnessed change in the sense that, a tougher political atmosphere, certainly a shift to what we would see as the left in economic affairs. So where does that bring us in terms of the book and why I wrote it? And there, it was a basic desire to get a better understanding of the Chinese Communist Party. What is this animal? What has kept it in power for so long? And what on earth in the first place actually brought it to power? So I wanted to get beyond just contemporary headlines and the current events to dig a bit deeper and try and understand the culture of the Chinese Communist Party, how it has ruled, with an eye to what that might mean for how it will continue to rule out into the future. So for readers, I hope it will provide them with the opportunity to understand that there was actually nothing inevitable about the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. It was a confluence of multiple factors. Of course, the invasion by Japan played a part, some of the social issues, but there were other factors really which were simple accidents. If Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang troops hadn't mismanaged some of the battles in the Northeast, it could have been a very different outcome. But I think in terms of post-49, what can we draw out from that? I think there's one or two lessons. First is that ideology and organization are crucial for the Chinese Communist Party. It likes to control as much of society as it can. It does that through the organization department with appointments, but it also does it through ideology and propaganda, creating a narrative that it then hopes that everybody will buy into. I think another key factor that helps explain post-1949 rule is that when it took power, it was very autonomous from forces within society. It claims it's the party of the working class when it took power, but hadn't really had any association with the working class since 1927. Some people call it a peasant army, but did it really represent the interests of the party? Maybe to start with land reform, but that quickly was jettisoned with collectivization, cooperativization. So it meant that in many ways, the party as a moral arbiter, as it saw itself, was independent from forces within society, which gave it tremendous capacity to pursue its own particular interests. And that means, I think, just to conclude on this particular question, it also means there's nothing inevitable about continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. It does need luck to keep going. The droughts, the pandemics don't undermine its authority. It will continue with harsh policies around critics, and it will continue to focus on ideology and organization. But, mistakes can undermine its competence and capabilities.
Yeah, I think what I like the most about your book is that it really looks beyond the contemporary discussion about China. I mean, there's so much attention paid to China based on, legitimate understanding or not. But I think throughout your book, the sort of common theme I think I personally have drawn out is how the Communist Party has been very flexible in reality, in terms of its own ideology and its own way of governing the country. But most importantly, I think with the center focus of managing the economy, right? Ultimately, it is about making sure that the people are being fed and they're not going to be hungry. Of course, it took 50s, 60s, and 70s for them to learn from their own mistakes. However, what we saw in the past 2 to 3 decades was a very, very successful economic transformation. I don't think anyone can deny that. However, China's growth is slowing down with a fast aging population, growing inequality, as well as the West's increasing distrust of China. So we're witnessing China closing doors and striving to be self-sufficient and focusing on the so-called dual circulation. I have many friends who are entrepreneurs and they have lost confidence in China's immediate future and wanted to leave the country or have left the country. Some even liken this change under Xi Jinping to Mao's era. Do you agree with all the assessment and the sort of current view of China?
Well, I'm going to give a classic academic answer to that, which is yes, no, and maybe. Let me come back to the first point you made about its adaptability and its flexibility. I think that has been extraordinarily important, explaining how the Chinese Communist Party has been able to survive, both in the present but also in the past. If you think in the 1920s, it was a party based on trying to produce urban insurrection and promote the interests of the working class. That was destroyed in 1927. It reorganized itself into the countryside, built military forces, and so on. And similarly, if we look at the present time, who would have thought coming out of the Cultural Revolution that China would have adopted the kinds of open door policies, the kinds of economic reform, somewhat grudgingly and often resisted, to open the doors to private industry. So you're right, that adaptation and flexibility has been extremely important. I suppose one wonders now under Xi Jinping, is that being ignored? Is it becoming a more rigid, more institutionalized and less fluid pattern of rule? And I think that is certainly true. If we look at the question of the private sector in the economy, again, I think we need to take a historical view of this. I mean, I think people bought into the idea that China was changing, would always change. But again, if we look back at history, when the party was formed in 1921, it had the express objective of destroying the capitalist class, getting the foreigners out of China. After 1949, it eradicated almost as soon as it could private enterprise, private business. So it's always had this sort of ambivalent feeling towards the private sector and its role. Now, the Mao era, no, it isn't the Mao era. I mean, yes, there's a code of personality, there's a lot of sort of revival of some of the Maoist slogans, but it's such a different world. I mean, whether Xi Jinping would like it or not, he cannot withdraw totally from the private sector. 60% of GDP, 85, 90% of new jobs, it's impossible. So I think if we look there, yes, there's an acceptance of the private sector, but it must operate in terms of meeting the objectives of the Chinese Communist Party. And again, I think let's disassemble things, decoupling, dual circulation.
Yeah.
Well, in part, that is, I think, from China's side, a response to what it sees as a more contentious relationship with the West, particularly the United States of America. But decoupling is possible in some areas, but clearly not in others. I think if we look at trade, if we look at investment, probably, certainly investment, with Congress bringing in new regulations, with China looking more critically at US engagement, that is an area where I think we'll begin to see some decoupling. Similarly with trade. And it's going to set up some tensions with Wall Street, with local governments, and with global businesses that desperately want to be involved in the China business. Other areas have already decoupled. AI, for example, and technology. China clearly is developing its own capabilities in that realm. And, for countries around China, it's creating a headache. You can't really run two different systems, a Western-based system and a Chinese-based system. Whether you like it or not, you'll be forced to choose. But then there's one area where decoupling is very unlikely and very problematic, and that's with financial markets. It's a multi-trillion-dollar engagement and China benefits from it enormously. There's no other place to turn to for the depth of capital markets that is offered by the United States. And China, to meet its objectives moving forward, is going to need that access. So that's why I said kind of yes, no, maybe.
And just on that, interesting that you mentioned financial capital market. That's an area I don't see China or the US decoupling, even though there are some political, movements or actions that are sort of, headed towards that way. But I think both countries and the world understand the bottom line is, serious enough that no one really would go there. Are you seeing any sign, or just curious why you bring that up as a possibility?
No, I mean, I agree with you. It's the one area where the interests of both the US and China would be severely eroded by unwinding capital markets. Right. I think China is nervous, though. There's no doubt about it. And we see that indicated in a couple of things in particular following both Russia's invasion of Crimea earlier and also the current invasion of Ukraine, where it's been particularly concerned and worried about the removal of a number of Russian banks from the SWIFT system. Right. That, I think, is very disturbing for China. It's also, of course, trying to, as a second measure, boost trade settlement in renminbi and trying to set up structures that facilitate that. I mean, that's still a very small part, though, of global trade, and it's an indicator, perhaps, of where China would like to go, as perhaps development of digital currency suggests. So it's clearly something that China is worried about, it's cautious about, it would like to pursue alternatives, but at the moment there are no real alternatives out there for China.
Yeah, so it sounds like China is trying to be self-sufficient with regards to technology. We see in the development of trying to be independent in terms of semiconductor manufacturing, and other areas like AI. But in areas like financial capital market, it's going to be difficult. And I think a lot of people see that vulnerability. So I'm going to, go to the question about how will China manage its relationship with the rest of the world? We're seeing lots of changes. Sorry. We're seeing lots of movements right now. Some say, China is moving closer to Russia. We see that Xi is leaving for Central Asia this week for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit and will meet with Russia's President Putin. And this is his first overseas trip since the COVID pandemic. So how is China going to navigate and manage its relationship with whether it's the United States, Russia, and others? And of course, Taiwan is another major issue when it comes to its relationship with the rest of the world.
That's a big question. Let me just first make one other comment about where I think China is going with technology. And I think if you look at a number of things related to decoupling, dual circulation, Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's part of a strategic push by China to try and develop capacities in the cutting edge technologies for the future. And I think this will bring me to answering your question more directly. I think when China looks at great power status and dominant powers in the past, it's been intimately related to standard setting in key industries, driving the economies forward. And I think China sees that. And I think that's why China is investing in those technologies. Now, whether it can achieve it or not, of course, is a different question. But I think that's part of the play that China is making, that it wants to be the standard setter of those key technologies for the future. And the Belt and Road Initiative is one way to export and use those technologies to its favor. So where does that leave us on the bigger question that you just asked? And I think what we see is essentially what China is pursuing, I think, is a kind of geopolitical risk mitigation. if you like. And I think it's operating that, and that's because it sees the continuing challenges from the West, and particularly the United States of America, and those are not going to go away in its view. And I think this risk mitigation operates at two levels. The first is what you were just pointing to, and that is doubling down on not alliances, it doesn't like to call things alliances, but much closer relationships with those countries that do not accept US dominance within the global order. And of course, the prime example there is Russia. And of course, we already know there's the kind of no limits relationship, which was announced between Xi Jinping and Putin. I don't see any evidence of that weakening, despite what is happening, in the conflict at the moment. There's no real incentive for China to back away from it. It doesn't necessarily provide it any benefits.
And maybe even strengthening that relationship, some may argue. Do you agree?
Yes, I think, Xi Jinping has put them in so deep, it's hard to sort of pull back again.
Yeah.
And I think one advantage for China is that if you have a weakened Russia, it becomes much more dependent on China. It's clearly the junior partner in the relationship. But of course, he wants a stable Russia. He doesn't want a chaotic situation on his border. But what that does do is it provides a huge reservoir of resources, natural resources and other materials for China in what it sees as potentially a long-term process of contention with the United States of America. And then I think the second...
we see that in the current energy crisis in the West, and China is buying more Russian oil.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean, and of course, that's a way out for Russia as well. So that's a match made in Marx's heaven, I guess, for them. So the second thing of this sort of risk mitigation, I think, is really promoting China's interests in those institutions and policy areas that deal with global public goods, where it sees either the US withdrawing or where it sees the China's core interests can be promoted better, or undermining those institutions that it sees not representing China's best interests. The most obvious recent example is the UN human rights regime. It's always been very concerned about that. And of course, now with the Xinjiang report, which has just been issued, it's moving very aggressively to undermine the credibility of that. But I think more important, but not necessarily more importantly, but similarly, there are other things taking place that, China does view international agencies as a way to assert their values and to exert stronger leadership from their side. So if we look, China has led 4 of the UN specialized agencies, all of which deal with crucial questions dealing with the setting of standards in telecoms, aviation, and agriculture. And it's also undertaken leadership in a couple of other organizations that set standards. So that, I think that's the kind of 2-part risk mitigating strategy it's been pushing forward. And it's driven by Xi Jinping's narrative that historical materialism shows him in a divine way that while China and the East is rising, it's the West, particularly the United States of America, that is declining. And that, I think, drives a fair amount of this thinking that now is a good time for China to move to promote its interests. Of course, it's not opposed to all the international organizations because much of it has served China very, very well. A number of people have speculated and written about whether the war in Ukraine is changing China's thinking towards Taiwan. I think there are, I would say, 3 or 4 things related to that. I think first, it's probably convinced the leadership in Beijing that given the balance of power in Asia at the moment, armed invasion is not really feasible and therefore not likely. Secondly, though, I think it goes back to one of the points you made earlier about decoupling. I think it's probably convinced the Beijing leadership that they need, as far as possible, to wean itself off reliance on Western technologies. And with that, one could include, of course, Taiwan in terms of semiconductor production and other particular factors of production. And also to try and think seriously about what it does around the question of financial markets. Mm-hmm. The third thing I would say is I think Xi Jinping's actions have not been a premonition for armed invasion. I think what Xi has done, and if you look at when they've been more aggressive, I think it's been primarily with the intention of stopping Taiwan declaring independence. I think that's the fear in Beijing, because that would critically undermine Xi Jinping's legitimacy. So I don't think it's to push reunification as such. And then the last point I would say is I think Speaker Pelosi's visit was a godsend for the People's Liberation Army. It gave it the perfect opportunity to have a kind of full-scale exercise, to rattle proverbial sabers, and to gauge what the kind of Taiwanese defense capabilities are in that situation. So unlike some, I think Xi Jinping is willing to play a long game. I think he thinks, tide is inevitably turning in China's favor. And that doesn't mean reunification as an objective is going away. In fact, it's stated as an objective for 2049 still.
That's super interesting how the two parts of the answers you provided just now. One looks at China in terms of its risk mitigation. The other with Taiwan is looking at it from more of preventing it from declaring independence. While I would say many others, especially those in the United States and the West, look at China as a more intentional actor. So in terms of global stage world affairs, some would say China is intentional exerting its influence rather than reacting to what the West may do to China. The other on Taiwan, some would say China is being more aggressive making the move because it actually wanted to annex Taiwan rather than being more passive and reactive to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence. I think these two views really shape how people perceive China as more of an imminent threat or as an actor that needs to be more managed or integrated into sort of the global normative behavior. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, in certain areas, it clearly is intentional. As I said earlier, I think it clearly has a clear objective in terms of exerting its authority around certain areas, industry, technology. In some ways, I see China's approach like a mixture of sort of Marxist views that ultimately capitalism will be overturned with the traditional Chinese notion of tianxia, where you see Chinese sort of cultural sphere radiating out, but much more extensively and powerfully than under the imperial system because of its economic might. Mm-hmm. And I think, following up from what you said, I do think you begin to see China being more intentional in that it is now beginning to say its model of economic, political development, while it says we do not wish to force it on others, they are now beginning to suggest more and more that it could be a model for others to follow, counter to that of the US. I think Taiwan is a different issue, and I think Xi Jinping is not stupid. I mean, he knows conflict there could be extremely detrimental to China's economic and long-term hopes. And I think he sees the capability to just squeeze Taiwan whenever he thinks it's necessary. Around trade, embargoes, maybe, snipping at one of the outlying islands. He can keep one by one stripping diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to keep up the pressure when Beijing wants to. So I think perhaps he's a little more, not relaxed, but is looking more to a longer-term solution that he feels will make it inevitable for Taiwan to come to him.
Yeah. On that, I know we're towards the end. The last question for you is really about how does the CCP continue its legitimacy, looking at the 100 years of history of the CCP being extremely adaptable and flexible in order to claim to its power. But we're also seeing China being quite controlling in many ways. The recent sort of severe COVID lockdowns in China and elsewhere, now in Chengdu, is one example. So what does that mean for China's governance moving forward, right? Do you think it's really continuing through this kind of very restrictive and almost authoritarianism kind of governing, is the only way to continue its legitimacy and controlling of China? Or, it needs to be more open and flexible in order to achieve its so-called China dream. What is this path forward?
What I think, of course, is not important. I mean, I think that to meet its objectives, it needs to shift significantly its economic policy. And of course, the open engagement globally has helped drive a lot of China's development. What is far more important is how Xi Jinping and other leaders in Beijing see the situation.
Well, they do read what you write and say. I have to say, the government has quoted multiple times some of the studies coming out of you and the Ash Center. So don't underestimate how influential your words are.
Well, they use what they want to use. Let's say that.
For sure, yeah.
Famine, plagues, and droughts are always the signs of the end of a dynastic cycle. So I think there is a certain fear amongst the leadership in Beijing and a paranoia which drives policy often. But let me conclude by saying two things related to this. I think the first thing that drives a lot of Xi Jinping's thinking is what happened to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He talks about it a lot. He talks about the fact that no one was man enough to stand up, to defend the party. And I think that fear is still there. And unlike Jiang Zemin, who I think saw one solution to that challenge was to loosen up somewhat, kind of soft authoritarianism, I think Xi Jinping has rejected that in favor of a hard authoritarianism. And, doubling down on, eliminating dissent, toughening up control over as much of economy and society as is possible. So I think that kind of hard authoritarianism is baked into the proverbial bones. On the question of legitimacy, it's quite clear that for most citizens, it's about what people call performance legitimacy. Mm-hmm. I think that is also why Xi Jinping is trying to strengthen study of Marxism, although I don't think a lot of people really believe in that absolutely anymore in China. But it's not just economic growth. They've been preparing their population for the fact that growth will slow, that it will never restore to the same high levels as in the past. And they've been buttressing it by a set of more populist policies, building social welfare infrastructures, and trying to promote common prosperity to deal with the inequalities in China. And it does mean that despite often what we think, the leadership has been responsive to some citizen concerns. If you think of corruption, the environment, the inequality, it has undertaken actions there. And then last but not least, what it tries to boost those populist measures with is the motivation of nationalism. Mm-hmm. And of course, from their perspective, reunification with Taiwan plays an important role in that. Finally, then, is that enough? Well, time off is going to tell. I don't think the current economic policies are going to produce sufficient growth rates. China doesn't need 7-8% growth anymore. But, if it begins to sort of stutter along at 2 to 3%, can it meet its domestic objectives as well as still projecting its power overseas? I think that becomes questionable. And then most of the problems, in my view, really relate to questions of governance. And there, the most noticeable example really is the re-centralization of power and the building of the cult of personality around one particular individual. And then I think the question is that what China really needs at this stage of its development?
Yeah, I think that was excellent in the sense that a lot of people misunderstood how China or Chinese Communist Party govern China or Chinese people. A lot of people assume that strict top-down approach is the only way for China or CCP to survive. But in reality, I think there is a lot of push, back and forth between the party and its own people. And I think that sort of being practical and being flexible is actually the secret to the CCP's longevity. So thank you so much, Professor Saich, for enlightening us today. There's so much attention paid to China, but very few really take a long and historic view. So thank you for sharing your decades of work and knowledge. For those who are interested in China, especially what's to come at the 20th Party Congress and beyond, I really encourage you to read From Rebel to Ruler by Professor Saich, a publication of Harvard University. So thank you for watching today and take care.